Hi guys, welcome back. Hope everyone's doing well. Today it's Tuesday, we're going to do another tutorial. This one's going to be a big one. We're going to do an in-depth design tutorial on how to do a tattoo design using PROCREATE. So I'm going to show you exactly what I do from start to finish when I make designs for clients. Hopefully it'll give you an insight into sort of all the different bits and bobs you can do with PROCREATE, all the extra things that you can achieve. If you didn't see my previous video from last week, the silently designing on PROCREATE, you can check that out with this link up here. This is going to go into a lot more depth and detail than that video. I'm going to show you exactly where I click, the reasons why I choose different settings, and hopefully, like I say, it should help you guys out. So yeah, without further ado, let's jump straight into it. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to obviously open up PROCREATE. So once you first open up PROCREATE, you get into this into the first screen, which has got all your existing designs, anything you've been working on. What we're going to do is you're going to start a new file. So you want to click the plus button in the top right corner, and then for me, I always choose A4. So the main reason why I choose A4 to work off, and I've done this when I used to do stuff on flat paper, is because body parts, when you're designing a tattoo for a client, the size is pretty much A4. So from wrist to sort of elbow, from elbow to shoulder, you're looking at A4. The chest, you know, again, depending on the person, but it's pretty much A4, same with legs and everything else. So if you work off an A4 scale, within a few little adjustments, you're going to be pretty much bang on the right size that you want. Plus, when you start designing onto that sheet, it's going to give you a strong visualization as to what that size is going to be like once it prints out. So for example, everyone pretty much knows in their head how big an A4 sheet is. So if you're working off that and you put something in the middle of it, you know that when it prints out, it's going to be sort of yay big. So yeah, I always work off A4. It keeps all my size and scale the same, and just gives me like a good strong sort of ability to print out and get the size pretty much right straight away. So make sure your canvas is A4. The first thing you're going to want to do once you've got that in there is just get all your images together and just get them in. So I've set up a folder already with all the images I'm going to use today, just for ease of me trying to find them. But once you've imported stuff into your camera roll on your iPad, you'll be able to just access everything from there. So just click the spanner tool on the top left. We're just going to go insert photo. So I've got this folder here, this PROCREATE tutorial folder, and these are the images that we're going to use. So I've got a rose, a portrait, some leaves, and then my arm template. I'll go into the arm template a little bit later, but first of all, we're just going to deal with these first three images. So click on the rose. That's going to drop it in at the resolution that it originally was. So at the moment, that's a little bit too big, so I'm just going to pinch it and just pull it a little bit smaller. Now we're probably going to resize that a little bit, but for the time being, based on that being on an A4, we're going to be looking at sort of that kind of size with the rose-ish. That's pretty much where I want to be. Again, we're probably going to make a few little adjustments with the size, but we just need to get everything in first of all. So we'll click the spanner tool again, insert photo, back into my album, drop the portrait in, again resize that so it's in the same sort of realm size wise. Click the spanner tool, insert photo, and we'll just drop those leaves in. So first things first, we need it all to be black and grey. So I mainly deal with just black and grey work. I do colour, but yeah, a lot of my work is black and grey. So all of this design process, we're all going to just be dealing with black and grey. So we're going to hide all the layers, go back to the rose, and then just turn everything black and grey. So if you click in the top right corner, you'll see the layers button. That's going to show you all of the layers that you've got currently in the file. So the way the layers works, if you imagine a stack of paper, the rose with it being on the bottom, that's going to be in essence as if a piece of paper was on the bottom, and you've got the portrait stacked on top of that and the leaves on top of that. Just gives you an idea as to how the layer system works and how things overlap. So if you need something to sit in the middle, obviously you're going to slot it in the middle. So we're just going to hide the leaves and the female face currently, and then we're just going to select the rose layer. So a good little tip which I was taught years ago when I did some games design is to always name your layers. So if you get a really complex piece where you've got a lot of layers involved in it, it's not too bad on PROCREATE because you get the really big thumbnail so you can see quite clearly what you're doing. But if you've got a lot of little small details or a lot of different text or little like background layers and stuff that are very similar. It does help, and it's good housekeeping just to rename your layers, just so it's very easy for you then to see where everything is and be able to access things quite quickly. So if you just tap the name, click rename, and obviously we're just going to call that Rose, then turn the layers off. So now we're going to turn this black and grey. So the easiest way is if you click this little magic wand tool at the top, go down to hue, saturation and brightness, and then we're just going to ramp that saturation all the way down to 0. So that's going to turn it black and grey. So at the moment that's fine. The image is pretty good. For me, and thinking forward into the tattoo process, I'm just going to want those levels a little bit stronger and just give it a bit more contrast. So what I look for when getting the contrast levels on pieces on the design, I'm thinking about my process of tattooing. The way I tattoo, I use a 3 grey wash system. So I have solid black pigment, dark, medium, light, distilled water, and then white. So I'm looking to get my tones on my design into that format, so I'm not trying to translate anything once I get into the process. I want my darks to be sort of within the realm of being either black or a dark wash. And then I want sort of like my midsection to be what I would use then as a medium tone, and then lights which are then just blended out, and then some real strong white highlights. So at the moment this is a little bit washed out. It looks quite nice on the eye, but for me, I don't want it to necessarily look nice on the eye. I want it to be a representation of what I'm going to do once I get into the tattoo process. That way for you it makes it easier to tattoo because you're copying it sort of one-to-one. You're not trying to make up any tones anywhere, and it's also going to show your client what you're expecting the tattoo to look like as well. So they're not going to see a really nice soft grey image, then see the tattoo that you have to ramp up those blacks a little bit to make it work as a tattoo, and then it's just going to be overly dark and it's not going to represent what they were sold in essence from the design. So the way we're going to do that, if we click the magic wand again, we're going to go down to curves, which is towards the bottom. So what curves will do, it's just going to adjust sort of the black balance to the midtones to the highlights. So looking at this little graph, at the moment we've got this big diagonal line running through, and we've got these 2 blue dots, so they're holding that line. So on the left hand side, that controls all of our dark tones. On the right hand side is all the highlights, so anything that's white, and then in the middle all of the midtones. So what we're going to do is just want to lower all of those midtones down, which is just going to give us that real big contrast. So right in the middle where the lines sort of cross, I'm just going to drop another dot in there, so just by tapping it, and I'm just going to pull that straight down, so you can see how that's just ramped up all of those shadows, just really made them pop, made them a little bit darker, and in turn it's made those highlights just that little bit more crispy. So that's just given me some real nice solid edges. It's given me those nice sort of curves on the petals, and it's just pretty much where I'd want to be once I get into the tattoo process. So now that that rose is done, we're going to go back onto the layers tab. We're going to hide that rose, and then we're going to unhide the portrait. I'm just going to rename that portrait, just so that we know that that's that. And then we're just going to do exactly the same as what we did to the rose. So we're going to click the magic wand, go down to hue, saturation and brightness, and then turn that all the way down to 0. That's going to give us that black and grey. We're going to click the magic wand again, just go down to curves. Now this image is pretty good. There's a nice solid cast on the face to get that shadow on that one side, which is where I try and get the levels to. The hair's pretty dark and we've got this nice highlight here. I do just want to just bump it up a little bit, so I'm going to do the same again, just drop one in the middle, but this time I'm just going to sort of just move it around a little bit just until those levels get to where I want. So that's just made that shadow on that one side just that little bit darker, which moving into the tattoo is just going to make my life that little bit more straightforward, and it's just going to give us a nice and more dynamic tattoo at the end of it. So back onto layers, click that one off, go onto the leaves. The leaves are going to be pretty straightforward. I'm not going to mess with the curves. It's just going to be a case of the magic wand, saturation, and then just turn that straight the way down. Click back on it, just rename that leaves, and then we'll hide that layer. So now that we've got everything black and grey, what we're going to do is we're going to start with the portrait. What I'm going to do here is, because the rose and the leaves, they're both isolated in the sense of they've got no background, we just need to ditch some of this background on the portrait. Now, I'm not too fussed about taking all of the background out. My thought process moving forward is to get the rose to sort of sit like over her shoulder, so I'm not too bothered about taking all the background out perfectly at this point. I want to take the bulk of it out just to get rid of that squared edge, just so it's a little bit easier to work with and makes a little bit more sense in my mind. So we're just going to take a little bit of that away, then we'll start layering everything up. If there's any extra bits that need taken out, we can then just nibble away at it. So with the portrait selected, click the eraser tool, just tap it again just to bring up the settings. What I like to use to erase a lot of the time is just the airbrushing tool. So if you click airbrushing and then we go down to soft airbrush. So the difference between soft, medium and hard airbrush is just the amount of feathering that's on the edges of the brush. So soft one, you're going to get a bigger percentage of feathering, which is where it goes from being like 100% opacity to 0. If we go to hard airbrush, it's just going to make that a lot tighter, sort of crispier edge, but we want it to be nice and soft just so it blends into that hair. So soft airbrush. Size wise, on the left hand side here, we're going to want that on 100 just so it's as big as we can get it. Opacity wise, we're going to want that on 100 as well, because we want to take away the background. We don't want to leave any little ghosting bits there. We're going to want it on 100, take it all away, and like I say, with it being the soft airbrush, we've got that nice feathered edge, so if we work further away than where we think, it's going to give us that nice soft sort of transition into the face. So I'm just going to start taking away some of this top edge here. Now I am adjusting my pressure onto the iPad as well, which just changes the opacity very slightly. It's not massively sensitive on this brush, so it shouldn't. So it should stay fairly uniform throughout. So all I'm trying to do is just get the background just pushed into sort of the outside parts of the hair. So I'm not bothered about going in between each individual strand. We're just going to just sort of take it away, because what I'm going to be doing later on is adding some background in, so we'll be able to then mix the two together and get it all to work. So that's just taking away a bit of that background. Still got that bit of a straight line at the top. That's not the end of the world. We'll deal with that a little bit later, but that's the bulk of the background taken out. So if we go back onto the layers, and we're just going to put the rose back on. So going back to what I was saying earlier about how the layers stack, you can see that the portrait's in the middle. So currently it's sat on top of the rose. So in essence, our rose is on the tabletop, and then we've got the portrait piece of paper sat on top of that. So we're going to need them to be the other way round, just so the rose is sitting on top of that shoulder. So if we click and hold that rose layer and then just drag it up and then just drop it, that's just going to reshift that order, and you can see straight away that rose is sitting on top. So once we've got that rose on top of the portrait, we're just going to click on that layer. We're going to click the arrow tool at the top. That's going to put us this boundary box around it. What that's going to allow us to do is to move it, manipulate it, and change the size. So by just pinching on the screen, and just change that size and just move it around. So what I'm looking to achieve with the rose is just to give us like a cut off on like an arm and a shoulder, so I haven't got any weird unnatural sort of eraser marks and things like that. So I'm just going to use the rose to give us that natural framing. So I'm just going to pull that just so it's not too overly sized, but you can see where the dark shadow of the shoulder comes in, that petal's just intersecting it and just cutting it off, and then the same down the back as well. So we're going to go back onto the layers and click the portrait. So when I was saying I wasn't too fussed about erasing everything on the portrait layer, this is what I mean now. So I'm going to click the eraser tool. We're back on soft airbrush, same settings as before. So the two little areas at the bottom that stick out of the rose, that's what we want to get rid of. So without putting that rose there, we didn't know what parts we wanted to get rid of and what parts we wanted to keep, but now that we can see the bits that are peeping out, we just go in and just take them away, and that way everything starts working together and everything's going to start blending. So at this point we want to start getting some leaves in there just to really add to that size and that scale, and just to make it really work. So go back into the layers, we'll hide these two and just open up the leaves layer, select that. So the leaves that I want to use, are these ones in the bottom left corner, just so I've got those two nice leaves together, and we can just get those to wrap around the portrait layer a little bit more and get that rose and the leaves to start hugging and making everything work together. So we just want to isolate those two there. So we're going to click this little tool that looks like a little S, selection tool. Make sure it's on freehand, and then we're just going to draw a little boundary box around those two leaves. They're the leaves that we want to keep. So what I'm going to do is I just want to turn those two onto their own separate layer. So if we click the spanner tool, we're going to cut. That's going to delete them off that layer, but give us a copy of it. Click paste, and that's going to put them onto their own individual layer. So if we go back onto the layers tab, you can see that we've got this inserted image at the top. That's the layer that we want to keep, and the leaves is what we want to get rid of, so we just want those two. So on the leaves layer, select it. If you swipe that to the left, you get a few little options. We're just going to click delete. That's going to clear off that layer. So again, just to keep everything nice and uniform, just rename this leaves. And that's those two leaves completely isolated there for us. So now that we've got those leaves, what we're going to want to do, go back onto the layers tab, and we're just going to turn on the other two layers. So you can see straight away that those leaves, with them being on the highest layer, they're sitting on top of everything. So we're going to want those leaves to be underneath the rose but on top of the portrait, just so that we can use those leaves just to cut off some extra little bits and to extend the design from a composition point of view. So on the leaves there, just going to click and hold it, just drag that down, drop it between the rose and the portrait. Straight away you can see that leaf is now underneath the rose. So at the top, we're just going to click the arrow tool. It's going to give us that boundary box. We're just going to pinch that and just resize it. So I'm going to want that to sit just at the top here. My placement for leaves is very specific. There's normally one or two reasons and why and where I place leaves. For the basis of this design, it's going to be to extend the image, to give it a bit of balance, and to cut off certain areas. So I'm placing these leaves at the top just to give us that little bit of an extension forward of her shoulder, but also to give us that nice cut, and then just get that other smaller leaf just to intersect and just to sit on top of the shoulder, just to give us that nice layering, to give us a bit of balance, and to give me some darker elements to sit down at the bottom where we've got those petals that have got the big highlights to them. We're just going to drop some more leaves down there. So if you go towards the top, click on the layers tab again, selected the leaves layer, just slide that to the left. That's going to give us those options like before. We're just going to click duplicate. That's going to give us another identical copy of those leaves. So if we click that button, you can see that it's just dropped a new layer straight above it. We're going to click the arrow tool. It's going to give us the boundary box. Now we're just going to pinch, rotate, and just resize those leaves just so they sit at the bottom here. So that's going to give us that balance. So we've got the leaves top and bottom of the rose, but what it's also going to do is going to give us a darker element that's going to hit the side of that petal. So what I don't want to be doing is putting big lines around any of my work. That's going to take away from the realism, pushing more towards something a little bit more cartoony. So to hold those edges, you're going to want darker elements, like darker pieces hitting against it, or some darker background sections. So I don't want to put background everywhere. I don't want it to be a real heavy piece. So these leaves are just going to act as sort of line work, in essence, just to give us that nice crisp edge against the bottom of the rose. We're going to add a little bit of background just to give it a bit of place and purpose, so it's not just a floating rose, and that should start sort of bringing the two together, mainly because we've got that little bit of background that we haven't taken out on the portrait. We're just going to try and drag it down a little bit further just into the rose. So the way we're going to do the background, we go into the layers tab. We're just going to add another layer by pressing that plus button. That's going to put that layer 5 just in the middle. Now we're going to want that right at the bottom, so we're going to want all the background to sit underneath everything. So we're going to click and hold that and just drag it all the way down to the bottom. We're going to tap it, click rename. Let's rename that background. So at the moment we've got a blank layer. So at the top we're going to click the brush tool, click it again to bring up our options. We're going to use soft airbrush again, so the same as what we used for the eraser, but we're going to be doing the opposite. So instead of taking parts of the design away, we're just going to be adding some grey and some black elements in there. So soft airbrush in the top right, the little circle, That's your color picker. At the moment I've got white selected. We're just going to drag that all the way down to the bottom left corner. That's just going to give us a black for the brush. Size wise, at the moment we're going to start with 100%, just so we can just put a load of stuff everywhere, and then we can always erase it back. Opacity wise, we're going to want it sort of around sort of the 20% mark. So what we want, we don't want to be going in at 100%. We don't want some solid black sections at this point. We just want to build it up nice and slow, again trying to match or get close to the background that's already there in the portrait. That way we don't have to try and worry about taking it out. We're just adding stuff that's a lot easier to try and match those tones. So with all those settings selected, we're going to start with the lighter sections down at the bottom by the leaves and those light petals. They're going to be our darkest bits, again just to hold those edges. So we get those in, and then working backwards from that, we can just keep everything uniform and just stick with that level of contrast with the background. So I'm going to start with just this edge here. The main areas that I try and put background is again anywhere where you've got sort of white hitting white, so these white petals which would in essence be against like the skin, or anywhere where you've kind of got like that V shape. So this little section here in between the two leaves, that would be like a nice little V, and then again where they sort of intersect onto where they start hitting the rows. So I'm just going to add just a little bit up here just to bring out that background off her back a little bit. We'll probably have to go back in and just take a little bit of this away just to get it to knit in with the background that was there on her shoulder. On this left hand side we'll just add a little bit, probably not as dark, but just so we've got something going on, because we've got a lot of dark tones there because of the heavy shadows that are being cast across that rose. We don't want to put too much dark background in there, otherwise it's going to be too heavy on that one side. So at this point, this is pretty much where I want to be with my background. I'm going to go too wild. I'm going to start nibbling way back into that with the eraser tool, just to give it a little bit more, sort of like a bit more of a dynamic look to it. We're just going to click the eraser tool, just click it again just to bring up the options, make sure we're on soft airbrush. We're going to bring that size down to about sort of 30%. Keep the opacity on full. We're just going to pinch into the image, which is just going to allow us to zoom in and just give it a bit of a twist, just so that the movement of my hand is now in line with the angle of the piece, because I just want to take away just a little bit just underneath this leaf. So this stems from me thinking forward to my tattoo process. So once I've got my leaves in, they tend to be the darkest element I've got in my piece, so they're going to be as close to being black as possible. So if I've got background next to it, I don't want a dark background hitting a dark piece. It's just going to get too muddy. There's going to be a lot of tones that are very close to each other, and it's just going to look like a bit of a big heavy black blob. So if I can, in the design, give me that little break, that little bit of separation. So down at this bottom section, let's take just these little bits away. Probably just a little bit there. So now I'm just going to bring the opacity right the way down to sort of the 20%, which is what we use to put in the blacks. And I'm just going to nibble away at this background just to bring it in just that little bit closer, just so we're not looking at getting a load of background as the whole piece. So I'm just going to bump up the size to 100. I'm just going to knock this back a little bit. It might look like you're not doing anything, but just sort of stick with it just to keep that nice and smooth. It's very easy to get tempted to bump up that opacity to try and get things done a little bit faster, but it's just going to end up looking a little bit choppy, and you're just going to see every one of those strokes. So you've got the lower opacity, just build everything up. Building is better. So already you can see how that looks a little bit like it's supposed to be there, and it's not that I've just bunged in a load of background just for the sake of it. Everything's there, and everything's got its own little purpose. We've got those nice little highlights peeping out from underneath those edges of the leaves, which gives them those little bit of separation. Then we've got all the background we need down the bottom just to hold those edges of the petals. So now that we're fairly happy at the bottom with the rose, I just want to make a few little adjustments to the face, with us just dropping those levels earlier on the curve, and because that affects all of it, it's just made the eyes just that little fraction too dark, but I want them to be a bit more punchy. I just want those eyes to really pop and just to give us a nice focal point. So we're just going to pinch into the face just so we've got that nice and big on the screen. On the layers tab, I'm going to go on the portrait, and what we're going to do is just add another layer on top. Now we're not going to rename this because it's going to be a temporary layer, but the reason for this is I'm going to make my adjustments on this layer, which are going to sit on top of the portrait. If I don't like them, I can just delete that layer, and I haven't made any changes to the portrait. If you do it on a separate layer and you don't like it, you can just delete it and get rid of it, or you can make a few adjustments with curves, with opacity, just to get them to exactly where you want to be. So with that layer 6 selected, we're going to click the brush tool, make sure we're on soft airbrush again. We're going to change the color back up to white this time. We're going to keep the opacity at about 20%. We're going to change the size down to about 4 or 5%. So I'm on 20% opacity, 4% on size, and then we just check the layer. So on layer 6, and what I'm going to do is just add in just a little bit of an overlay on the top, so just like a white highlight, just to give those eyes just that little bit more brightness to them so they're not getting lost, because what I don't want to be doing is once I get into the tattoo that I'm just doing a big black eye. This one that's in the shadow, I don't want to go as extreme, because it is in the shadow, but I do just want to give it just that little bit of something going on. So if I zoom that back out, you can see already, especially that eye that's closest to us, how much punchier that looks. So the highlights that are already in the eyes, they are pretty strong, but I'm just going to exaggerate those a little bit more as well. I'm just going to bring the size down to 2%, and starting with this darker one, just bump that up. And then just bump up that highlight without doing that. And straight away you can see how punchy that is. So if we go back onto the layers, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop that off. So that's the original eyes that we've got on there, and then with the new adjustments, we're into this sort of level. So you can see how they look a lot more glossy, a lot more piercing, and it's just going to be a lot easier to work with once you get into the tattoo process. So now that I'm happy with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge those two layers, which in essence is going to put us into the realm of drawing straight onto that portrait layer. But if I wasn't happy with it, I could just take that off, start a new layer, and I haven't affected that portrait. To merge the two layers on layer 6, if you just tap it, it's going to give you options for the layer. What we're looking for is at the bottom we've got merge down. So if we click that, you can see that it just drops it in, merges those two layers, and now those little adjustments that we've done are now directly onto that portrait layer. So at this point, what I like to do is, if I was doing this for a client and I had my client there, I'd be taking a photograph of their body part, and dropping that in, and that way I can get the size and the shape and make a few extra little changes directly onto where I was going to tattoo, so we can get pretty much, again, within a few tiny adjustments, the right size that we're looking for, and it's going to give your client a very strong visualization as to what that tattoo is going to look like once it's physically on them. Because I haven't got a client for this piece, I've got two options. So my first option, which is what I tend to do for putting designs out there, is just dropping in just a very simple drawn arm template. So if I go into the spanner tool and click insert photo, go back into my folder, and this is the arm template that I have. So if I just hide all of these layers, so this is what we've got. So it's a real simple line drawing of an arm, and then I've just filled out the background section. So anything that sits underneath that, the only bits that are going to show are the bits that are on the actual arm itself. So if I put all of these layers back on, At the moment it's sat weirdly in the middle, so it's doing this weird cutting. What we want it to sit on top of everything. So we click and hold it, drag that right the way up to the top. So you can see straight away that what we've got now is we've just in essence got a piece of paper with an arm cut out, which is just showing us all of our design straight the way through it. So we go back onto the layers tab. Now what we're going to want to do is start resizing all of our sort of design elements to start getting it to fit onto that framing of the arm. You could select them all, but what you're going to find is if you keep wanting to change it and change your mind and change the size, you have to keep selecting all those layers. The best way to do it all in one go is just to set them all as a group. So if we click the rows and then all the design layers underneath, we're just going to select them all. So if you swipe your pen just to the right, that's going to select all of the other layers, so you can see how they're all blue. That's going to give us some options at the top now. So we've got delete or group. You press the group button, that's going to drop all of those into a group. Click the arrow, it's going to collapse the group down. Now we've got everything together in one group, so we can just manipulate everything in one go. So we click the arrow tool, it's going to give us the boundary box. You can see that's got everything in it. We're just going to pinch that just until we get to where we want to be, sort of size wise and composition wise on the arm. So I'd be looking somewhere kind of along those lines. So we've got the face nice and big, filling that meatier section of the forearm, and then as we start tapering down, the roses fill in that. You can just see the leaves peeping. So yeah, that's going to feel quite nice. Just to get a slightly better view of how that's going to work, we just go back onto the layers tab where we've got the arm template. You just click that little N button. That's going to give you all the blending options plus the opacity levels. So we're just going to drop that down to about 80%. Click off the layers. So that's just going to make all of that white background that's masking everything just a little bit more transparent, so you can see what elements are going to be wrapping, what bits are going to be sort of out of view from that panel. So the only bits we've got that are going to wrap around, just the back of her hair, a couple of the petals on the rose, and then some of the leaves. So looking at that, we're just going to have the hair just tickling onto the forearm. We're going to get some nice leaves going onto the wrist, which is going to be really nice. And then we've also got this petal, leaf even, that's just going to sit on this side. So we're just going to get a nice hugging around the arm, and we're not going to get too much overwrap. So now that we've got to grips with the composition and where it's going to sit, looking at it, I can see that I just want to add a few extra little elements. So a little bit at the bottom down towards like the wrist section, and then just smooth out the top of that hair just so we haven't got that straight cut across the top. So I'm going to go into my layers tab. I'm going to hide that arm template just for the time being, just so that we're dealing with just the design. Go into the group, click on the rose, and then we're going to click the plus button. That's going to drop a layer above the rose. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some lens flare. So with that layer 8 selected, click the brush tool. For this we're going to go to hard airbrush, because we're going to want that edges very nice and crisp. We don't want that feathered edge. So hard airbrush on the color picker, make sure that we've got white. Size wise, we're going to want full size, full 100% size. Opacity wise, we're going to be about sort of 24-25%. So what we're going to be doing in essence is we're going to be doing two circles that overlap each other in the middle. So set at 25%. If you imagine you've got two circles at 25% opacity, once they cross over, that little middle section, that's going to be 50%. So if you do, for example, 50% opacity, once they cross over, that middle section is going to be 100%. So it's completely going to block out anything that it sits on top of, but we still want that transparency there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop two circles in. And like, as you can see, they're just going to slightly overlap each other. Because we're on a separate layer, it means that we can click the arrow tool at the top and then move those and put them wherever we need them to be. So I'm probably just going to bring this one up and just drop it sort of at the top. So just to see where that's going to fall, if we go back onto our layers tab and just put the arm outline in, you can see that's going to just sit towards the top. Now obviously at the moment you can't see the top of those circles just because there's no background there to give them an edge and definition, but we'll add that in a second. Just before we do that, I'm going to go back onto my layers tab. On the little layer we've got for those lens flares, I'm just going to swipe that to the left, click duplicate, which is going to give us another version of that. Click the arrow tool, and then we're just going to pull that sort of down towards the bottom, just so we've got one at the bottom just to add that little extra bit just down by the wrist. So just to make those a little bit more defined now, if we go back onto the background layer, brush tool. Now instead of using that soft airbrush for this, so we get that real soft, smooth background, I just want to give it a little bit more texture at this point. So a tool that I use a lot, or brush, if you go down your list and find elements, and then we're going to use the cloud tool. So it's going to give us clouds, but the way we're going to use them, it's going to just look like a rough sort of texture, some nice sort of interesting shapes and patterns going on, as opposed to just that smooth airbrush finish. So select clouds, go onto the color, drop that down to black. Size wise, probably about 30, and then opacity just somewhere in the middle, about 50%. So we're on the background layer, on the right brush, and then we're just going to start adding just some sort of rough sort of texture, so you can see how it kind of gives you that almost watercolory look to it. And then we're just going to add some just at the top here, just so that we're slowly starting to sort of ditch that line in the hair. So that sharp line that's on the top of the head is still very, very apparent, and we obviously don't want that, so we want to try and get that bit of mixing, bit of a merge between that and the background. So what we're going to do in essence is the reverse of what we've just done with that cloud background. So if we go into the layers tab, click on the portrait, go on the eraser tool, click it again to bring down the drop down menu. Again, find the elements on the brushes, make sure we've got cloud selected, click off that, and then we're going to want sort of roughly the same size, so about 30%, but we're going to want full opacity on this. So if we just start taking a little bit of that away, and it just softens the top of that head just into that background just that little bit, takes away that edge, and starts making everything look a little bit more purposeful. And then we're just going to maybe go a little bit smaller and just nibble in, just so we can start getting some interesting shapes. That's pretty much where I want to be. Like I say, it's just extended that background a little bit further, and as you can see, it's not added anything extra in the way of sort of like physical design elements, but we've now got just a little bit of something that's just made it that little bit longer, allowed me to go a little bit darker with the background. But once you get into the tattoo process, you won't physically be tattooing anything there, because those lens flares are going to be left almost as skin, and it's just going to give you that little bit of something extra than just the two flat images. So that's pretty much where I'd want to be with regards to the design process. So at this point, this is where I could save this out as a JPEG, send this over to a client, they can have a look at it, and then they get to grips with sort of how big of a size I'm thinking, the composition, how that's going to sit and fall on the arm, and with very little explanation from my side, that should easily show a client how it's going to work, how it's going to sit, and how it's going to look moving forward onto their arm. Especially if you take a photo of their arm and then use that arm as the template, that's going to make it even more visual for them to understand how big and where it's going to sit. Well, that's it guys, that is a full design from start to finish on the iPad using Procreate. Hopefully that's given you an insight into all the little settings that I change, all the bits and bobs that I click. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, hopefully you found something interesting from it. If you did, make sure to click the like button, subscribe to my channel if you're not already, and you'll get all my latest updates on my new videos. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace!